evening, Shavua Tov, good voch. Great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Nancy, North Carolina, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Guy in Ohio, Shandor in the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Lucy in Minnesota, Tracy in Alabama, Sharon in New Jersey, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Alan in New York City, Sharon in New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. We're moving on from comparing the relative severities of the death penalties as we enter Mishna number 2 here in chapter 7 of Tractate Sanhedrin, the 24th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 7 now, Mishna number 2 on page 52. We are still in the death penalty. And today we're going to learn about the second type of death penalty. We've been learning about stoning. Now we're going to learn about burning and what that meant. And of course, we will get into the technicalities and how it's done, etc. But tonight will also include some fascinating, digressions and wisdom teachings. Let's get into it right near the top of 52a with Mishnah 2 of chapter 7. The mitzvah, meaning the commandment, because, when people commit this crime, it's a commandment to execute them if they're convicted of the crime. The mitzvah of those who are burned, i.e. the process of execution by burning, is carried out in the following manner. The executioners submerge the condemned one in dung up to his knees so that he cannot move. There's a note on dung, but submerge him in dung. Some explain that the condemned one is submerged in dung up to his knees so that he soils himself due to being afraid people will not notice and he will not be disgraced. It's actually a favor to him that he's submerged in dung. Fascinating. But the purpose of being submerged up to his knees is so that he cannot move, and they place a rough scarf within a soft one so that his throat will not be wounded, and they wrap these scarves around his neck. This one, i.e. one of the witnesses, pulls the scarf toward himself, and that one, the other witness, pulls the other end of the scarf toward himself, until the condemned one is forced to open his mouth as he is choking. And another person then lights the wick and throws it into his mouth, and it goes down into his intestines and burns his intestines as he dies. This wick is not a candle wick. We're going to learn in a moment what it means. Rabbi Yehuda says, but if this one who is condemned to death by burning accidentally died at their hands by strangulation, well, then they have not fulfilled the mitzvah of execution by burning for this person. So rather, the process is carried out in the following manner. One opens the mouth of the condemned person with prongs against his will, and one lights the wick and throws it into his mouth, and it goes down into his intestines and burns his intestines, and he dies. And Rabbi Lazar ben Tzadok says an incident occurred with regard to a certain priest's daughter who committed adultery, and they wrapped her in bundles of branches and burned her, like our image of burning at the stake. But this was contrary to the process described in our Mishnah. And the sages said to him, that court did not act properly. This was not the law. They did so because the court at that time was not proficient in halacha. The court made a mistake. They should not have executed a person in that manner. That's Mishnah number 2. Now the Gemara. What kind of wick is the Mishnah referring to when they say they light the wick and it goes down the throat of the condemned person? Now listen, this is not easy stuff to be talking about if this is your first time with us. Okay, well, this is not what we're ordinarily talking about, but this tractate is about courts of law, and one of the important jobs that a court of law does is that it tries death penalty cases. And there are various kinds of crimes for which a death penalty is assigned in the Torah. And if a person is convicted of that crime and merits the death penalty, okay, well, then there has to be a death penalty applied. And we're going to study the law of that in the same kind of detail that we would study the law of how we enter into contracts and how we recite the Kiddush on Saturday night, etc. We're looking into the details of it. And let's also remember the teaching that, if somebody is condemned to die, we're going to talk about this tonight. We're going to make that as the least pain possible while still fulfilling the particular obligations of that form of death penalty. We're not looking to impose unnecessary cruelty. Having said that, we have to check ourselves because people who are kind to the cruel end up being cruel to the kind. So let's remember that teaching. Okay. The Gemara. What kind of wick is the Mishna referring to? So Rav Matana says a wick of lead, meaning a long, thin piece of lead in the shape of a wick, which is melted and poured down into the intestines. I mean, this is a death penalty. From where do we derive that burning means this kind of death? It is derived from a verbal analogy between the burning that is described in the context of capital punishment at Leviticus 21:9 and the burning described with regard to the assembly of Korach when they were burned by God in the incident described in Numbers 17:4. Right? Korach was a member of the Levite tribe in the wilderness when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and then were in the desert for some time. And Korach said to Moses and Aaron, who made you the boss? Why should you be the boss? Obviously, God made Moses the boss in the desert. He was the prophet receiving the Torah and leading the Jewish people. And Korach was already a member of the Levite tribe who had special responsibilities. But that wasn't enough for Korach. And so, he incited a bunch of people to kind of rise up and rebel against Moses. And God did not like it, separated Korach and his followers from the rest of the people. And they died. God smote them. God carried out the death penalty on Korach and his followers. Ultimately, the earth swallowed them up. But there was also this aspect of burning. What was this aspect of burning? And that's what we're learning about now. So just as there, with regard to the assembly of Korach, they were killed by the burning of the soul within the body. But the body itself remained intact. So too, here the condemned one is executed by burning of the soul, but the body remains intact. He is not executed by means of the burning of the body with wool, burning at the stake, burning with wood, burning at the stake. Rather, because in that case, the body would be consumed, right? So this is meant to be actually, okay, it's painful, obviously, but the body remains whole. So there's a body, for the family to bury afterward that's less disgraceful, less degrading for the person who's executed in this way than if they were burned at the stake. In the incident with Korach and his followers, right, they challenged Moses, and Moses said, okay, well, tomorrow we're all going to bring an incense offering in our fire pans, and we'll see, whose offering God accepts. And then, if you think that, I've outgrown my usefulness as a leader, we'll leave it to God to decide. And he'll accept the offering who God chooses to accept. So needless to say, God maintained Moses as the leader of the people, Aaron as the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and Korach and his followers, the fire that came and consumed the incense from Moses' fire pan also killed these people. And we're going to read a little bit more about that. It killed them, but it didn't burn them up. Okay, it didn't burn them up. Their bodies were still there. Now we're on page 50. We're on the next page. No. Now, so Rabbi Elazar says that there is a different source for this method, not looking at Korach and his followers, but rather it is derived from a verbal analogy between the burning that is described in this context of the punishment, the death penalty of burning, and the burning that is described with regard to the deaths of Nadav and Avihu. These were the older sons of Aaron, Moses' brother. So they would have become, they were next in line. They were the sons of Aaron, so they were gehinnom, they were priests. And Nadav is the oldest of Aaron's sons. He was in line to become the next Kohen Gadol, the next high priest. But they brought strange fire into the sanctuary of the Lord, and they perished. The Torah is very terse about what exactly they did, but because the next teaching is to Aaron and his future descendants, that when you come into the sanctuary to serve as a priest, and especially the inner sanctuary as a high priest, you shall not drink alcohol. You cannot be intoxicated. And so some offer the interpretation that Nadav and Avihu perhaps were intoxicated and brought strange fire, some unauthorized ritual that they did on the altar, and then the fire from the Lord came and consumed them. Different interpretation altogether is that they were filled with love for God and just wanted to come closer, but again, they brought some kind of, made up ritual, not following the laws that were given, but doing their own thing, as it were. And that, again, a fire came from God and their souls left their body. But in either case, after this burning happened, their bodies were still there. It wasn't like this fire came and consumed them and left ashes. Their bodies were still there. Therefore, if we have to impose a death penalty, if a court has to impose a death penalty by burning, better the person should, be forced to drink this molten lead, which will kill him, but will leave the body from the outside intact. Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron. This incident was at Leviticus 10:6. And just as there, Nadav and Avihu were killed by the burning of the soul, but the body remained intact, so too here, when the court-ordered execution is carried out by it should be by burning of the soul, and the body remains intact. Now the Gemara asks, from where does the one who derives that burning means this kind of death from the assembly of Korach derive that their bodies were not burned? Doesn't say that explicitly in the Torah. And the Gemara answers, he derives it from that which is written at Numbers 17:3. And the fire pans of these men who have sinned with their souls, which indicates that only their souls were burned, but their bodies were intact. So the Gemara shifts the question. How does the other sage, who does not derive that burning means this kind of death from the incident of Korach, interpret the deaths of the assembly of Korach? So that sage would say that the burning in the incident of Korach and his followers was an actual burning of their bodies. And what is the meaning of the term with their souls? It means that they were deemed liable to be killed by burning due to the matters of sustaining their souls. What does that mean? I.e., they sinned because Korach helped them fulfill their bodily desires, and consequently, they followed him, right? So that's very interesting. Greater lesson there. This is, it's kind of in passing, but what's being offered here is the idea that, what was Korach's rebellion, right? He said that, who made you the boss? Okay, that's obviously, what am I calling it? Like a summarization. That was not the actual exchange, of course. The midrash says that he said to them, we are a nation of priests. How can you say that, one priest is higher than another? He also said, what if you have we have techelis, that our tzitzis has to have a blue thread in it. He says, well, what if the tzitzis is going to be attached to a garment that is made of all techelis? So then does it also need fringes? But what he was really getting at is, if we're a nation of priests, how can you say that you or anyone else has a right to be our leader? Right? Now, you need leadership, and God had appointed Moses, but it was that kind of argument. That's the logic. But it was also that Moses was the lawgiver, and Moses was telling the people, he was just giving over the Torah that God was giving him, but along with the Torah comes all these restrictions, right? That things that Jews must do and things that Jews can't do, right? So Jewish men are going to have to pray 3 times a day. That wasn't actually fully derived yet. But they're going to have to bring all these offerings. They're going to become obligated in bringing offerings if they do any kind of a transgression. They can't boil a kid in its mother's milk, from which we end up deriving that you can't cook, meat and dairy together. You can't just, have sex with whoever you want to have sex with. You can't eat pork. You can't eat lobster. There's all these foods that you can't eat. And so, all these things elevate us and become opportunities for greater holiness. But from just a physical appetite point of view, they're restrictions and you can't just do whatever you want. So if Korach comes and makes up a new set of rules and says, the rules that Moses is teaching you, maybe he's making those up just to serve him. I'm going to be a reformer. I'm going to be, a better leader. I'm going to give you what you want, right? Isn't that the promise of every politician who wants to unseat the current politician? I'm going to give you what you want, right? And so people, it wasn't a large number, thank God, right? It was a very small number of people who flocked to Korach. But you can say it was because they agreed with him philosophically, theologically, or really was it because they just wanted to eat certain foods and do certain practices that would have otherwise been prohibited for them? That's often a motivation of people who can attract followers to them. Now, this latter explanation is in accordance with the statement of Reish Lakish. As Reish Lakish says, what is the meaning of that which is written, quote, with the flattering mockeries of spitefulness, ma'og, they gnash at me with their teeth. That's Psalm 35, verse 16. It means that because of the flattery of these people who flattered Korach over matters of eating, i.e. because of the food and drink that he would give them just to win them over, bread and circuses, so to speak, the minister of Gehenna gnashed his teeth over them as they eventually sinned and fell into his hands, meaning the minister of Gehenna. The minister of Gehenna is an angel whose job it is to run Gehenna, right? Gehenna is a little bit like hell in the way it's portrayed in the popular culture. It's a place that is temporary for 99.999% of the people who go there, and that is actually most humans. Right? We leave this world. We're going to be held accountable for all our misdeeds. We'll be rewarded for all our good deeds. But if there's some kind of imbalance there and there's stuff that we need to make up for, so we go to Gehenna, God forbid, temporarily to be refined of those sins, and then eventually we move on to our portion in the world of souls, right? In heaven, in the higher world where there's a million different levels. And then there's, the Talmud says elsewhere that there are, a few individuals who are so wicked, a Hitler type, that go to Gehenna and never leave Gehenna. But that's, very rare, very rare. Okay? But here they're saying that it was these people that initially were tempted, by the food that Korach was offering them that they could eat to follow him, be his acolytes, and they ended up in a terrible rebellion. The stakes were very high, right? And that's why the wood gatherer, what was executed for violating Shabbos, which, who knows if that ever happened again in Jewish history. But when the Jews have just received the Torah directly from God, and they're eating manna directly from God every day and drinking water from a miraculous well that goes with them everywhere, and there's clouds of glory that are not just regular clouds that are shielding the sun in the hot desert, and they're literally living in God's presence, which is accompanying them everywhere. Like it's not like us where you have to imagine, what is God? Where is God? What is it like to be in communication with God? Like, there's miraculous manifestations of God constantly around them. In that environment, to rebel against the Torah, to rebel against Moses, God's appointed leader, it has different consequences and immediate consequences than other points in history. So these people end up in Gehenna. The Gemara asks, and from where does the one who derives that burning means this kind of death and derives it from the story of the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu. Where does he derive that their bodies were not burned? After all, that is not said explicitly in the Torah. And the Gemara answers, he derives it from that which is written. Quote, and fire came out from before the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Leviticus 10:2. And the term, and they died, indicates that it was similar to a natural death in which the body remains intact. If it had just said devoured them, you might have thought that they were burned to ash. But since it says the fire devoured them and they died, and the choice of words here indicates that the body remained intact. The Gemara asks, and how does the other sage who does not derive that burning means this kind of death from here interpret the death of the sons of Aaron? And the Gemara answers that burning was actual burning. That's what this view would be. And in that case, what is the meaning of that which is written, and they died? It means that the fire started from within them, and therefore it was similar to a natural death which occurs within the person. As it is taught in the Baraisa, Abba Yosef ben Dostai says, 2 threads of fire came out of the Holy of Holies and split into 4, and 2 entered the nostrils of this one, and the other 2 entered the nostrils of that one, and the threads of fire burned them. But the accepted view is it was some kind of holy fire that consumed their souls and that the bodies remained intact. The Gemara asks, but isn't it written, and devoured them? And the usage of the expanded term for the devoured them is how we're translating vatochal otam. This is an expanded term, vatochal otam, which could have been written in one word with suffixes always attached in Hebrew as vatochlem, indicating a limitation, i.e. only they were consumed to the exclusion of their bodies. And the Gemara answers, the verse means that the fire devoured them, but not their clothes. And the Gemara asks, and let us derive the correct method of execution by burning from the law of the bull offerings that are burned. And just as there, the reference is to actual burning, so too here, perhaps there should be actual burning. The word burning occurs in the Torah when we're talking about offerings like bulls. Why not say that if somebody is to be executed by burning, they're burned like a bull? And the Gemara answers, it stands to reason that one should derive the law with regard to capital punishment from the death of a person, either from the assembly of Korach or the sons of Aaron, as they share common elements. They deal with a person, a sinner, and a soul that is taken through burning, i.e. the person dies as a result of burning. Furthermore, the halacha of an offering that was sacrificed with the intent to consume it after its designated time, pigul, is not relevant in either case, whereas it is relevant to bull offerings that are burned. Gemara says, on the contrary, one should derive the laws with regard to capital punishment from the bull offerings that are burned, as both enable the fulfillment of a mitzvah, whereas the deaths of the assembly of Korach and the sons of Aaron were not mitzvahs. It was carried out by God, not by a court. Furthermore, both of these are fixed halachas for all future generations, whereas the deaths of the assembly of Korach and the sons of Aaron were one-time incidents. And the Gemara answers this challenge by saying those elements that are shared by capital punishment in the deaths of the assembly of Korach and the sons of Aaron are more numerous than the elements that are shared by capital punishment and the bulls that are burned. Therefore, the law is derived from the assembly of Korach and or the sons of Aaron. And the Gemara asks, with regard to one who derives this law from the assembly of Korach, what is the reason he does not derive it from the sons of Aaron? Because in his opinion, that was actual burning. But if this is the case, let us derive from the death of the sons of Aaron that execution by burning should be performed with actual burning. Why does he derive from the assembly of Korach that hot lead should instead be used? And Rav Nachman says that Rabbi Bar Avu says, the verse states, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, which in this context means or teaches that even with regard to a condemned prisoner, one should select a good death for him, meaning a compassionate death for him within the limits of what's permissible by the law. So the method of burning described in the Mishna is certainly faster and less painful than burning of the entire body. I mean, I can't imagine what a death by pouring hot lead down your throat is, but I'm willing to accept that that's going to be faster and less painful than burning at the stake. The Gemara asks, and since there is the law of Rav Nachman, why do I need the verbal analogy? Even without this proof, execution by burning would have been performed with hot lead, as it is less painful. Why do we even need to compare it to the assembly of Korach or the sons of Aaron? And the Gemara answers, were it not for the verbal analogy, I would say that a death that includes the burning of the soul, but the body itself remains intact, is not burning at all, and that it does not fulfill the commandment of execution by burning. And if it is necessary to alleviate the condemned one's pain due to the law of, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, well, then let the court increase for him the bundles of branches so that he will burn quicker. Therefore, the verbal analogy teaches us that even internal burning is regarded as burning, and once this has been established, it is taken into consideration that he must be executed in the least painful way. Apropos the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, and Agad, the sons of Aaron, an Agadic midrash on this subject is quoted. And it had already happened that Moses and Aaron were walking on their way. Now, this is another midrash that I've learned elsewhere, which was part of the reason that Nadav and Avihu ended up, bringing this strange fire, and then God, smiting them with a fire that emerged from before the Lord and took their souls. And this is a midrash that helps explain that. A midrash. There's different ways to explain a midrash. Sometimes it's a tradition that's not written in scripture but has been passed down, teacher to student, father to son, all the way from Mount Sinai. So it's a true event that we know through this oral tradition. And sometimes it's more of a creative, story to help us understand. And we're not always sure, which is it. So here. The midrash says, and it had already happened that Moses and Aaron were walking on their way, and Nadav and Avihu were walking behind them, and the entire Jewish people were walking behind them. And Nadav said to Avihu, when will it happen that these two old men will die, and you and I will lead the generation, as we are their heirs? And the Holy One, blessed be he, said to them, we shall see who buries whom. About this, Rav Papa says, there's an old saying, right? So even when Rav Papa was living and teaching, let's say 1800 years ago, this was already an old saying. Many are the old camels that are loaded with the skins of young camels. Many are the old camels that are loaded with the skins of young camels. Young and strong versus old and wise. It's not an easy outcome to predict, but young and strong usually thinks they're going to win easily, and old and wise often has something to say about that. Rabbi Eliezer says, and now we're on page 52b, to what is a Torah scholar compared when he is standing before an ignoramus? At first, when he does not know him, the ignoramus considers him to be like a goblet of gold. Right? So an ignoramus, this would be a Jew, an Am Ha'aretz, who doesn't know any, he's not educated in Torah. But he knows enough that when he sees a Torah scholar that everyone respects because he's a Torah scholar, that he respects him too. You can say, well, that guy's respected by everybody. He must be worthy of respect. Once the Am Ha'aretz, right? Am Ha'aretz is like people of the land, but it's usually translated as ignoramus, right? So once the Am Ha'aretz has conversed with the Torah scholar concerning mundane matters, he considers the Torah scholar to be like a goblet of silver, i.e. the stature of the Torah scholar is downgraded in the eyes of the ignoramus. And once the scholar has received benefit from the ignoramus, then the ignoramus considers the scholar like an earthenware goblet, which once broken cannot be fixed. Is that interesting? Yeah. Very interesting, right? If you, if you're trying to carry yourself in a refined way and to aspire to higher levels of spirituality and closeness to God and understanding of Torah, etc., be very careful who you associate with, right? You should absolutely be very polite. Greet every man with a smile. We learned that from Shammai, who's usually stringent in all matters. But when you get too familiar with people who are very coarse and vulgar, I'm talking about ignoramus, that's a coarse and vulgar person. When you get too close to them, they lose respect for you. And then, because you're talking about mundane matters, and then if you ask them for a favor, if they're able to do something for you and give you something, then they don't respect you at all. Interesting. The Gemara relates, Imrata bat Tale was a priest's daughter who committed adultery. Rav Chama bar Tovia surrounded her with bundles of branches and burned her. So he burned her at the stake. The penalty was burning, but he applied, according to what we've learned so far, absolutely the wrong death penalty. Rav Yosef says Rav Chama bar Tovia made a mistake with regard to two laws. He erred with regard to the ruling of Rav Matana, i.e. that burning is performed using a wick of lead, and he erred with regard to that which is taught in the Baraisa. It is derived from the verse, and you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge that will be in those days, Deuteronomy 17:9, that at a time when there is a priest serving in the temple, i.e. when the temple is standing, which it hasn't been in 2,000 years, but when it is standing, there is judgment of capital cases, which means that at a time when there is no priest serving in the temple, i.e. when the Holy Temple is not standing, which is what it's been since the year 70, 2,000 years ago, there is no judgment of capital cases. Rabbinic courts do not try capital cases since the temple was destroyed. So what was Rav Chama bar Tovia doing trying a capital case and imposing the death penalty? This was extrajudicial. This was outside of halacha and was an emergency, right? This was an emergency because the level of the people was falling so much, and he was making an example of someone to try to get the community back on track. Technically, that person deserved the death penalty. It wouldn't have applied, but he applied. Now, the Mishnah teaches, our Mishnah, that Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, said, an incident occurred with regard to a priest's daughter who committed adultery, and she was executed by actual burning. Now, her partner in adultery was also executed, but that was a different death penalty. Burning is for this person. So they executed for adultery, and she was executed by actual burning with wood. And the sages said to him that the court at that time was not proficient in halacha. They did it wrong. Rav Yosef says it was a court of Sadducees, Tzadukim. So the Tzadukim were the ones who rebelled against the Chachamim, the rabbis, right? Also known sort of in popular language, English language, as the Pharisees. So the Sadducees were the people who said, well, yeah, this oral tradition going back to Moses, we don't hold by it. We don't hold by it. We only apply the written law, only what's written in the Torah, which is impossible, right? Because how do we know what tefillin is? Tefillin is not described in the Torah. It just says that these words shall be a sign on your hand and a symbol before your eyes. How would you know what tefillin is? So that's one of the examples. Why were the Sadducees opposed to the Pharisees? Because they were making a power play at a time when the nation's spiritual level had descended. There were lots of problems, and this was really about political factions that were warring. And almost like I mentioned before, Korach was making ideological arguments to really just get power for himself. There was a lot of that going on with the Sadducees. So here, the Sadducees decided to take action and kill somebody through execution. And since the Torah says burning, they burned with a stake. And they either hadn't heard the law or were purposefully not applying the law as interpreted by the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara asks, did Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok say that to the sages? And did the sages answer him in that manner? But isn't a different version of this exchange taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, says, I remember when I was a child and I was riding on my father's shoulders, that's how young I was, And they brought a priest's daughter who had committed adultery, and they surrounded her with bundles of branches, and they burned her. And the sages said to him, "You were a minor at that time, and one cannot bring proof from the testimony of a minor, as perhaps you did not understand what you were looking at." And the two versions of this exchange do not accord with each other. And the Gemara answers, there were two separate incidents, and Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok testified with regard to both. Well, the Gemara asks, which incident did he tell the sages about first? If we say that first he told them about this first incident, i.e. the one that is recounted in the Mishnah, this is not reasonable. If he first told them about the incident that occurred when he was an adult and they paid no attention to him but rejected his statement by responding that the court was not proficient in law, would he tell them afterward about the incident that occurred when he was a small child and think that they would pay attention to him? So rather, it is clear that he first told them about that incident, the one recounted in the Baraisa that he saw as a minor, and they said to him, "You were a minor, so we can't bring proof for that." And then he told them about the incident that occurred when he was an adult, and they said to him, "Well, okay, so you saw this twice in your life. The first time you were a kid and you didn't understand what you were looking at, and the second time you were an adult, but the court who imposed that death penalty got the law wrong. We're not going to learn out from that court that we should burn at the stake. That is the wrong answer. If somebody has to be executed by burning, we do it, with this molten lead that leaves the body intact after the death." And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 7. Mishnah number 3. The mitzvah of those who are killed. Now we're talking about the process of execution by decapitation. This is carried out in the following manner. The executioners cut off the person's head with a sword, the same way that the monarchy does when a king sentences a person to death. Rabbi Yehuda says this manner of execution is improper, as it degrades him, because his head falls off. Rather, they place the head of the condemned on the block and chop it off with a cleaver. They're like, well, okay, the head went off anyway. In the first case with a sword, and the second with a cleaver, how is that less degrading? The rabbi said to him, if you are concerned about his degradation, there is no death penalty more degrading than chopping his head off with a cleaver. It is better for him to be executed in the manner described first, where he's beheaded by a sword. That's where the Mishnah ends. I will say, in passing, I made a movie in film school about Henry VIII. And it was called Great Harry and Jane, and it focused on his marriage to his third wife, Jane, whom he really loved, after his disastrous marriages, first to Catherine of Aragon and then to Anne Boleyn. Catherine of Aragon was like it was a way to bring nations together. She was a princess of Spain. He was the king of England, who never expected to be king. He was not the oldest brother, but then his brother died, and he was surprised to become king. It was a loveless marriage, and the problem was they never had a male heir. Instead, they had Jane, one daughter, who ended up becoming, Mary, one daughter, Mary, who ended up becoming Bloody Mary. But no male heir. And a king, especially a king of England, whose father was a usurper, needs a male heir. So he invented divorce. He invented the Church of England so he could divorce Catherine of Aragon and take a lot of money from the monasteries. I'm sure Bill is typing away. He knows a lot more about this than me. And Anne Boleyn, the second wife, who he was very into physically, but turned out to not be a good queen and didn't provide the male heir, did provide a daughter named Elizabeth, who ended up being one of the most powerful and successful monarchs England ever had, Queen Elizabeth. And then the third wife, Jane. Now, and that was, you can see my movie, I think, online somewhere, Great Harry and Jane. But with Anne Boleyn, he ends up, basically, he needs to get rid of her, and they end up fabricating charges against her that she committed adultery, and so she was beheaded. And in his great mercy, great King, Henry VIII, sent for the best headsman in Europe, who uses a sword in place of the axe. Right? So just this idea here that the sword is considered a more compassionate and more honorable way to be beheaded than the axe. I mean, how much of a difference does it really make to the person who's being executed is arguable, but they're arguing the same point here in this Mishnah. Now the Gemara. It is taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda said to the rabbis, I too know that it is a degrading death. But what shall I do? As the Torah states, and you shall not follow their statutes. Leviticus 18:3, i.e., it is prohibited to adopt the practices of the non-Jews. And the Gemara asks, and how do the rabbis respond to this claim? And the Gemara answers, since decapitation by the sword is written in the Torah, it is not from the non-Jews that we learn it. This is Torah law. And the custom of the non-Jews is not even taken into consideration. It is of no importance that they have a similar type of execution, since the Torah provides for execution, decapitation by the sword, when we're talking about, killing someone by the sword as a court-ordered execution. We use the sword to decapitate them. As, if you do not say so, that we can never, if you say that any practice that non-Jews do, therefore Jews can't do it, this is going to create other problems. If you say that a Jewish custom is not forbidden, even if the Gentiles have the same custom, then that which is taught in a Baraisa poses a difficulty. Because this Baraisa teaches, one burns vessels and clothes over the deaths of kings as an expression of grief. And this is not forbidden for being of the ways of the Amorites. How can we perform this burning? But isn't it written, and you shall not follow their statutes? Rather, since burning items over the death of a king is written in the Bible, as it is written, and with the burnings of your fathers, the first kings who came before you, so shall they make a burning for you. Not you will be burned at the stake, but rather you're going to die, and when you die, there's going to be bonfires, to commemorate that you're gone, which was a practice that they had, right? Then when kings of Israel would die, or kings of Judea, they would have this bonfire after the death, sort of like mourning the old king, perhaps celebrating the new king, but they would do these bonfires, even though non-Jews had a similar custom. It is not from the non-Jews that we learn it, and here too, since the decapitation by the sword is written in the Torah, it is not from them that we learn it. And by the way, this line in Jeremiah 34:5, right, that there will be a burning for you, being said to a king or to a great leader, this is the source for why the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whose burial place is in Meron in Israel, and at Lag BaOmer every year they have these huge bonfire, right? A huge bonfire, and people sing and dance in memory of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's credited with writing the Zohar. This is the source for why they have that bonfire. Now, the Gemara asks, and with regard to that which we learned in a Mishnah in another chapter of this tractate, on page 76b, these transgressors are those who are killed by decapitation. Now a list, right? Who is executed when convicted of a crime and then is executed by decapitation of the sword? Who is it? The murderer and the people of an idolatrous city. But then there is a difficulty. Granted, the people of an idolatrous city are executed in this manner, as it is written concerning them, quote, you shall smite the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword. Deuteronomy 13:16. Okay, that's clear. Right? Now we know why we're decapitating the people who live in a city, a Jewish city in Israel that, when the temple is standing, the whole city has become idolatrous. They're all worshiping idols. So they're going to be destroyed. And we also learned already that all their possessions are burned in a fire. No one takes the spoils of that city. That whole city went bad. And here's the explicit law in the Torah that they are decapitated with a sword. What about somebody who commits murder? How do we know that they are decapitated with a sword? The Gemara answers, that is derived as it is taught in a Baraisa. It is stated in the verse, quote, and if a man smites his slave or his maidservant by the staff, and he dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Right? So if a man owns a Canaanite slave and kills his slave, that man can be subject to the death penalty. Quite interesting, right? Slavery as it was practiced in the ancient world, I guarantee you, if somebody killed his own slave, he wasn't subject to a death penalty. The Torah came and gave protection even to the slaves of the Jewish people, the Canaanite slaves of the Jewish people. So it says, if he dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Exodus 21:20. Prima facie, I do not know what this vengeance is referring to. When it says, and I will bring upon you the sword, avenging the vengeance of the covenant, in Leviticus 26:25, you must say that the word vengeance points to decapitation by the sword. The Gemara asks, but why not say that the executioner should stab him with a sword? How do you know it's decapitation? The Gemara answers, it is written with regard to the people of an idolatrous city with the edge of the sword, indicating that the execution should be administered with the edge of the sword, not its point. The Gemara asks, but say that the executioner should cut him in half, gestera, down the middle of the body. Why not chop him in half with the edge of the sword? How do you know it's the head that needs to be cut off? The Gemara answers that Rav Nachman says, that Rabba bar Avu says, the verse states, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which teaches that even with regard to a condemned prisoner, one should select a good, meaning compassionate death for him. Cutting his body in half is not a compassionate manner of execution. The Gemara asks, we have found proof that one who killed a Canaanite slave is executed by decapitation. But from where do we derive that one who kills a free man is executed in the same manner? And the Gemara answers, but is it not inferred? Kal v'chomer, or in Latin, a fortiori. If one who killed a Canaanite slave is executed by the sword, should one who killed a freeman be executed merely by strangulation? All the more so he should be killed by the sword. The Gemara rejects this answer. This works out well according to the one who says that strangulation is a more lenient type of capital punishment than decapitation. But according to the one who says that strangulation is more severe than decapitation, what can be said? It is possible that one who murdered a free man is in fact executed by strangulation, since he should have a more severe penalty than one who killed a slave, according to this logic. The Gemara answers, the Mishna derives it from that which is taught in a Baraisa. It is derived from the verse, and so shall you put away the innocent blood from your midst. Deuteronomy 21:9. That all spillers of blood are compared to the heifer whose neck is broken as atonement for the unresolved murder. When you find the corpse of a murder victim between cities, and we go through the whole ritual of the heifer whose neck is broken, right? That is an atonement for this unsolved murder within the land of Israel. So just as there, the heifer is killed by the sword and at the neck, so too here, murderers are executed by the sword and at the neck. And the Gemara challenges this. If so, perhaps it should be derived that just as there, the heifer is decapitated with a cleaver and at the nape of the neck. And so too here, perhaps murderers should be decapitated with a cleaver and at the nape of the neck. And the Gemara answers that Rav Nachman says, that Rabba bar Avu says, the verse states, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which teaches that even with regard to a condemned prisoner, one should select a good, meaning compassionate death for him. Although the type of capital punishment is derived from the heifer whose neck is broken, the most compassionate method of decapitation is the one selected. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Now, Mishnah 4 here in chapter 7. The mitzvah of those who are strangled in a court-ordered execution is carried out in the following manner. The agents of the court submerge the condemned one in dung up to his knees so he cannot move, and one of them places a rough scarf within a soft one, and they wrap it around his neck. And this one, i.e. one of the witnesses, pulls the scarf toward him, and that one, the other witness, pulls it toward him until the soul of the condemned one departs. Right? So this is basically like hanging, but interesting, they don't hang. They wrap a scarf around, rough one within a soft one, right? So I think that means to strengthen the scarf so the scarf shouldn't break, but it shouldn't, harm his neck. And they pull until he suffocates. Gemara. The sages taught. The verse states, and a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, even he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Leviticus 20, verse 10. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the term, a man, this is interpreted as excluding a minor boy who committed adultery before he came of age. He can't be guilty of adultery. This is a woman who's some kind of pedophile, right? I mean, she had sex with a child. And so she committed adultery and, sexual abuse. And she's going to die. The boy isn't. The phrase, who commits adultery with another man's wife, this is interpreted as excluding the wife of a minor boy. Because you might have thought that this woman married a child, but she didn't, because there's no marriage with a minor. It's not a marriage. So she's not married, therefore it's not adultery. And his neighbor's wife, this term excludes the wife of another, i.e. a Gentile, who is not referred to as his neighbor. Right, so that's interesting. So if a Jewish woman is married to a non-Jewish man, and she has, sex with another Jewish man, so that's not going to be an adultery case that comes before a rabbinic court to sentence her or her paramour to death because she married a non-Jew. And according to Jewish law, that's not marriage. Shall be put to death means death by strangulation. Do you say that his execution is by strangulation, or is it rather by one of all the other types of death penalties stated in the Torah? You must say that it is by strangulation, as everywhere that the death penalty is stated in the Torah, without specification, you may not take it to be more stringent with regard to it, i.e. to mean that the sinner should be sentenced to a severe type of execution. Rather, you must take it to be more lenient with regard to it, i.e. that a lenient type of execution should be applied. Consequently, the sinner is sentenced to be executed by strangulation, which is considered the least severe type of capital punishment because it leaves the body entirely intact. Right? Stoning obviously damages the body. Decapitation obviously damages the body. Even burning with the hot lead inside, very painful. And who knows what the outside manifestation of that is. But somebody who is suffocated by a scarf being tightened around the neck might leave some red marks around the neck, but otherwise the body will be intact for burial. This is the statement of Rabbi Yoshia. The Baraisa continues, Rabbi Yonasan says, it is not because strangulation is the most lenient type of capital punishment. Rather, there is a principle that every death penalty stated in the Torah, without specification, is nothing other than strangulation, whereas the other types of capital punishment must be stated explicitly in the verse. Right? So if there's not a reason to apply one of the other death penalties to a case that results in death penalty, then the default death penalty is strangulation. Rebbe says, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yonasan, death at the hand of heaven, that's charis, right? So that's something where the Torah tells you if you commit that crime, you'll experience death at the hands of heaven. That means a rabbinic court won't do anything to you, but you should know that you have now subjected yourself to a trial in heaven, and they're going to cut your life short. And the sages disagree what charis means, how much time is taken off your life, can you atone for it and get back your sentence, make it appeal, so to speak? Does it mean you will die without children, or that God forbid a person should lose children? Those are all they argue about exactly what death at the hands of heaven means. Death at the hand of heaven is stated in the Torah, and death at the hands of a person, meaning a court-imposed capital punishment, is stated in the Torah, right? The Torah refers to both kinds of death penalty, at the hands of heaven and at the hands of an earthly court. Just as the death at the hands of heaven that is stated in the Torah is a death that leaves no external mark, so too, death at the hands of a person that is stated in the Torah is a death that leaves no external mark, and that would be strangulation. The Gemara asks, but why not say that perhaps it is referring to execution by burning, which we just said before, also leaves no external mark? And the Gemara answers, from the fact that the Merciful One states explicitly that the daughter of a priest who committed adultery is executed by burning, one can learn by inference that this other woman who committed adultery is not liable to be executed by burning, or anybody else who commits adultery. Right? Burning is only in that specific case. So, if she's not a priest's daughter and she commits adultery, death penalty, but the type of death penalty won't be burning. It's going to be a different type of execution that does not leave a mark. And what's left for that? Not decapitation, not stoning, therefore strangulation. And finally, at the top of page 53a, granted, according to Rabbi Yonah's son, it is clear the punishment for adultery is strangulation, in the manner that Rebbe explains the reason for his opinion. But according to Rabbi Yoshia, from where is it derived that there is a punishment of execution by strangulation in the world, i.e., in halacha at all? Since this type of capital punishment is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah mentions burning, the Torah mentions decapitation, death at the edge of the sword, and the Torah mentions stoning. The Torah does not mention strangulation. Where do we get it? Since this type of capital punishment is not mentioned in the Torah explicitly, say that decapitation by the sword is the least severe type, as it is mentioned in the Torah. Where do we get strangulation from? Tune in tomorrow at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Okay, take a few questions. Lucy, it sounds to me like maybe Korach was electrocuted, maybe like the two sons of Aaron. But to the people then, it seemed like they were burned from the inside, and so they tried to mimic that with the hot lead poured in the throat. I mean, interesting. You're kind of interpreting that this, sort of divine fire was a type of lightning and a little bit closer to a natural phenomena. But, maybe this divine fire was some kind of, who knows, some kind of light and energy, not electric necessarily, but, it was miraculous, right? It was miraculous. We can't imagine what it was because these people in the desert coming out of Egypt, after 10 miracles, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds is a better translation, which there's many interpretations of what that was, right? At the very least, the wall, the sea parted and it was like a wall of water. And some say that there was a separate path for every tribe. There's even one interpretation that says there was a separate path for every person. And that the people who crossed the Sea of Reeds on dry land and could look into that water and see all the other people and reach into the water for whatever they needed, and that they were healed of any disease that they might have had at that time, and that they experienced a level of prophecy that was never known again, right? That the least spiritual person who crossed the Sea of Reeds experienced a level of prophecy that was higher than Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel and all later prophets. So they were just in a realm, right, where the sort of barrier between heaven and earth had become completely fluid and malleable. And who knows what they were seeing, so we can't, I understand what you're saying. You're giving a midrash, basically. But we don't know. We don't know what the nature of that fire was. They're just trying to learn out principles from it that we could apply when they were trying to decide what burning means for a court-ordered execution. Bill, burning by hot lead, as described here, would, apart from all else, result in swift suffocation. As gruesomely I admit, your larynx would be sealed. Burning at the stake also generally results in death by suffocation from smoke inhalation, but it takes a long time, and you're on fire while it's happening. In a phrase, it kills you and hurts the whole time you're dying. So I think what you're saying is burning by hot lead would be terrible for, like a few seconds, but quickly it would lead to death. It actually is much less painful and more compassionate than burning at the stake. Sharon responds, the retelling of the execution of Rabbi Akiva burning at the stake in the martyrology part of the Yom Kippur service certainly bears that out. Exactly. I mean, they were talking about the terrible pain that the martyrs, who were executed by the Romans, some were burned at the stake, some were flayed. Terrible, right? And the Romans purposely slowed down the death so that they would endure that pain longer, right? Like they sort of protected parts of the body so it wouldn't die so fast. I think they put like wet wool around part of the body so that it would take longer for him to die. I mean, just awful. The Romans were so awful. And Bill says, the thing about the Sadducees that I often think of is this: early Christians and our Jewish brethren during the first century could only agree on three things: that there was one creator, God of all things and all people, that the Psalms were way, way cool, and that the Sadducees were awful. Okay, very good. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night. Good vach, Shavuot tov.